one of the things that we talk about in the teachings is the 8 verses of training the mind. And these 8 verses in the context of the Buddhist tradition are considered to be very, very important. So important that the Dalai Lama has specifically given teachings on these 8 verses. Right? And so one of the 8 verses, one of the things about the 8 verses is that if you've never read them and you read them, you should notice your mind reacting to what you're reading, right? Because your mind does not believe in or want to practice these verses, because according to your mind's interpretation of these verses, your mind will say, wait a minute, this is telling me to let people get away with murder. This is telling me to let people abuse me. This is telling me to consider their abuse a blessing. That's insane. I would never practice that, okay? Well, I understand that it would occur to you that way when you first read it. But it's very important to understand that these verses were written thousands of years ago in a different culture, and language was understood differently at that time. So much of what's being said here is, in a sense, esoteric. So much of what's being said here can only really be useful is if you study the 8 verses, not just read them and not just take what they say literally, but use them as a takeoff point and listen to the teachings. For example, in the copy I have of it here, it's on the bottom, it says, commentary by His Holiness the Dalai Lama can be found at, and there's a website. And I really invite you and encourage you to take the time at some point to listen to the Dalai Lama's teaching on the 8 verses, because he goes into what's behind it. He goes into the understanding that's behind it that allows it to make a lot more sense. One of the 8 verses that doesn't require a lot of deep understanding is the 3rd verse. In my action, in my every action, I will watch my mind. And the moment destructive emotions arise, I will confront them strongly and avert them, since they will hurt both me and others. That one verse is a practice, you know. But the only way you can practice that one verse is you've got to be awake enough to be paying attention to your mental activity and be paying attention to it, not identified with it, so that you could recognize when destructive emotions arise. You know? Emotions like fear and anger are compelling. You know, in other words, if you're very angry, when you were very angry, so angry that the anger had you behave, so angry that the anger had you speak, you couldn't help yourself. You had to do it. You had to act out. When you're that angry, the energy of the anger has compelled you to identify with it. So you've got to be able to stay awake when destructive emotions arise. And I was noticing this because one of the things that's changed for me out of these practices and teachings is that anger is something that doesn't happen very often at all anymore. And when I think back about it, and this should be true for you too if you practice consistently over time, when I think back about it, there was a time when I was angry a lot, at a lot of things. Angry at the other drivers, angry at anybody that wasn't being the way they're supposed to be with me, right? Well, that's going to include your family, right? And your kids, and your partner if you're married, right? So there's a lot of anger going on. And what I had noticed is that through these practices and teachings over time, that became less and less. And now there's only very few instances when the anger is strong enough that I can't catch it. You know, I can't catch it before it is compelling me, you know. The energy is taken over, right? And so what I've done with those, and it's basically one particular thing that my wife has the key to. One particular thing that when she does that, I still go crazy. So, but the last time that happened, I didn't go as crazy as I used to go. And the last time that happened, after it happened, I made a note to make a specific distinction about exactly what she was saying and exactly how I heard it, right? So that in the future, when that shows up, I'll recognize it. And if I can recognize it before it overwhelms me, then there'll be an opportunity for me to do what this says. Confront the emotions, the destructive emotions, strongly and avert them. In other words, do not let that energy use your mouth, right? Do not let that energy cause your behavior, right? That's the first phase, right? If you succeed with that phase, then the next phase is when it comes up, you're still aware that it's playing in your head and the emotions still come up, right? But they're not strong enough to overtake you anymore. And so the next phase is to be aware of that and not identify with it so that it will fall away sooner, right? And if you keep doing that, right, it will cause that emotional reaction to start to die down and die out. That's called using the understanding of the fact that the brain is plastic. The brain has neuroplasticity. And by relating to unworkable thoughts and emotions without acting them out and seeing them for what they are, right, over time, the neural patterns associated with that will begin to weaken and eventually die out. Okay? So you're changing your brain. You're making your brain more peaceful. You're making your brain and your mind calmer, able to accept things as they are and relate to life the way life is. One of the things the teachings focus on in the tradition is paying attention to your mortality. Why? Because to the personality, that's the biggest unwanted event in your life, is your death. Right? And the way the teachings work is the teachings teach us to practice experiencing the way we feel about the inevitable situations that are occurring in our life, right? So that we can let go of identifying with those emotions and over time allow those reactions and those emotions and that resistance to begin to soften and begin to quiet down. And that's one of the reasons why my teacher up in Ithaca is a good model, right? Because when he talks about the situations he's experiencing as an 80-year-old, and his body is doing what 80-year-old bodies do, it starts to come apart. Right? And when he talks about it and he shares about that, he shares about it in a way that it's clear that he's not in distress about it. He shares about it in a way that he is, when these things are happening, he's there for the experience of it happening. He's not in a reaction to it. He's there for an experience of it happen. He's not in a thought process about it that is disturbing and causes disturbing emotions. This is what we're up to. This is what we're practicing, right? But you cannot be successful in changing the way your mind is and training your mind, right, unless you are practicing not just formal practice of meditation, but you begin to understand you've got to practice this in your life as you're living, not just in formal practice. In formal practice, you're sitting in a controlled situation for the most part. You're not in your life. You're not in the reality of the things that are happening in your life. If you're succeeding in the formal practice, it should be a natural extension of that at some point for you to understand, okay, now that I get the gist, now that I understand my true nature, and now that I understand what happens when I identify with thinking and emotions and let them determine me, now I want to apply that and put that to use in my life. So what? So that I can have better relationships with other people, so that I can have a better relationship with my own mind and body, right? And so I can begin to relax and prepare myself for the eventualities that are coming. Right? There are some things that are predictable, and those things are, as they say in the Buddhist tradition, old age, sickness, and death, right? But what's going to happen when you get older could happen when you're younger, right? We don't know. You know, you don't know how long you're going to live. You don't know how old you are right now. In order to know how old you are right now, you have to know when you're going to die, wouldn't you? Yeah. If you're going to die this week, you're old. It doesn't matter how old your body is, right? And you don't know when you're going to die, right? So do you want to keep gambling with that? Right? Better that you should prepare now. You know, it's like David Radin said, you know, when he thought his wife wasn't going to make it through the night because she was that sick, he sat down and began to allow himself to experience her death. He didn't know whether she was really going to die or not, right? But he was beginning to allow himself to have the experience. One of the things he said last night in the talk is he said, if you have a partner, he said his wife shared with him about a friend of theirs who was sharing their life with a partner, and the partner was 73, and the partner suddenly died. And the person who was sharing their life with that partner was in shock and overwhelmed and couldn't handle the experience of the loss, right? And what the teacher said about that is if you have a partner that's 73 years old and you have not begun to experience, allowing yourself to experience the loss of that person, you're being stupid. Any two people that are in a marriage should be aware of the fact that one of the two of you is going to die first, unless you're lucky enough to die at the exact same time in an accident or something, right? That's lucky, right? Because nobody's going to be having a loss there. The loss happens to both people at the same time. But for most people, that's not the way it goes. One of the two people dies first, right? So you should be aware of the fact that there's a probability that that person is going to die before you, and you should begin to allow yourself to make contact with the reality of that experience when it happens, so that when it happens, you're not hit with a shock that your personality cannot handle, and then it throws you into a state of overwhelm. It throws you into a state of depression or anxiety or fear. And many people, when that happens, cannot come out of it. They stay stuck in grief for many, many years, sometimes spending the rest of their life in grief, or sometimes getting so sick and overwhelmed by the stress they're under from the loss that they die too from that, right? So this is what these teachings and practices are about. They're not about some airy-fairy thing. They're about the fact that, as the Buddha said, life is suffering for most people. Why? Because they're living life in a mental state, and because they're unprepared for the eventualities that are inevitable in life. Loss is an inevitable experience in life. David Radin, my Zen teacher, had his house burned down, right? And he was, by that time, had been practicing for many years. And when he came home and saw his house on fire, there was nobody in the house, so there was no problem with that. And so he was just standing there looking at the house burning, right? And one of the local newspapers was there, and the reporter came up to him and said, this is what they always do in the news, it blows my mind. What's it like to watch your house burn down? You know, when something tragic happens, they go up to the person that's suffering the tragedy and say, what are you experiencing? You know, everybody wants to see what you're experiencing. So they asked him, you know, how does it feel to watch your house burn down? And he turned to them and said, do you have any popcorn? That's what it's like to be practiced, right? That you can accept the eventualities that are inevitably going to happen. You don't know what they are going to be, right? Between now and the time you're dealing with your death or the loss of somebody very close to you, there's going to be a lot of losses occurring. You're going to lose money. You're going to lose possessions. We don't know what's going to happen. There could be a serious accident, right? You could lose a leg. You could lose an arm. You could lose your sight. You could lose your mind. If you have a serious head injury and you have total amnesia, you lose your personality. You don't know who you are anymore. So you could lose your personality, right? Or you could lose your mind in terms of senility or dementia as you get older, right? So what these teachings and practices are saying, we don't wait for that stuff. We understand that this is life. This is how life occurs, right? And we're doing these practices to, over time, to gradually bring our mind out of an unrealistic perspective, because the mind is in an unrealistic perspective, If the mind is producing thoughts that are telling you all the time that things that are happening shouldn't be happening, that they're wrong and they should be different, that's an unrealistic perspective. So what you're training your mind to do is to be able to be related to things as they are. It's a very profound understanding when you let yourself realize that nothing is ever different. Do you get that? Nothing is ever different. Everything is always the way it is. But the mind is very committed to things being different, isn't it? Yeah. It plans on making things different in the future. I'm going to make things different in the future. If my relationship with my wife doesn't get better, I'm going to make things different in the future. I know, because I've done that 4 times. It doesn't work, by the way. It doesn't work. It's a very costly experience, and it doesn't work, right? Better that you should deal with your mind than deal with the circumstances. The circumstances are always changing, including your personality, right? The thinking that's happening in our mind about the circumstances is where the suffering is happening, not the circumstances. It's not your death that's a problem, it's how you feel about it and what you think about it that's the problem. You know, many of you may have heard the saying, the thoughts about death are much worse than death. The feelings about dying are much worse than dying. You know? As my teacher said, you don't have to worry about dying, it's going to happen to you, you're not going to do it. All you have to do is practice relaxing when it comes, that's all. You don't have to have it be a kicking and screaming on your way out experience. Right? You can just relax and allow yourself to understand this is natural. Dying is as natural as being born, right? But we think being born is wonderful and we think dying's terrible. It's the same exact thing. We see it in nature all the time. Every year we see everything die and then come back again the next year. It's all happening by itself. It's just the way it is. There's nothing wrong with it. It's not bad. And the reason that we're so terrified of death is because we believe that what we are is going to disappear, isn't it? We believe that what we are is going to disappear. The evidence is very clear, especially if you've studied some of the teachings and you've gotten a little deeper into it. The evidence is very clear. That's simply not true. It's simply not true. What you are as awareness doesn't exist in time and is not physical, right? So how is it going to die? It literally, if you really understand the truth, what you're understanding is that death is not possible. It doesn't exist. It is not real. Now, the mental state that we're conditioned to be in can't get that. I can tell you that, and I can elaborate on the details of how true that is, right? It won't change anything in terms of your mental reaction to the idea of dying. Because that's so thoroughly conditioned. What's so thoroughly conditioned is that you are this body. If I ask you to think of something that happened in your past and imagine it in your mind's eye, you see a body, don't you? Yeah, that's how thoroughly we're conditioned that we are a body, and that conditioning is a conditioning that will cause us to fear death. Because we believe that when this dies, that the personality is in here. And when this dies, the personality dies, that means I die. Okay? The truth is that's not true. But until you practice sufficiently over time to calm your mind down and to get clear that the teaching is the truth, right? You won't be able to relax enough to allow that to happen when the time comes. Just like everything else. You won't be able to relax enough to allow the people in your life to be who they are. You won't be able to relax enough to allow the circumstances that are occurring in the world to be the way it is. But you must understand the profound teaching, which is that it's never different. It's always just the way it is. So your practice, through the formal practice and the informal practice, your practice is practicing paying attention to your mental activity to notice when it is arguing with what's happening. And when it's arguing with what's happening, you don't identify with that. You recognize that this is a conditioned mind, and this conditioned mind needs to calm down, and so you do whatever you can to help it to calm down and relax. What that may mean is you start to pay attention to your breath and get yourself present to the present moment when the mind, it's got you in the future and the past. What that may mean is when the mind's upset, that you take a walk. Take it for a walk. Or sit down and have a cup of tea and just be quiet, right? But what you don't do is allow yourself to identify with it and get upset. That's what the practice is. And if you keep doing that practice, you'll be easier to get along with. And if you keep doing that practice, you'll be able to enjoy life because you'll understand that life is not difficult. And there's nothing ever wrong in life. There are no problems in life. What's difficult is the way we think about life, and those thoughts stir up emotions that are uncomfortable. That's the problem. And so the teachings and the practices are addressing that problem. In order to deal with your mind effectively, you've got to be able to stay awake and see it. That's what the practices are, and that's why the informal practice is practice resting as awareness for brief moments as often as possible during the day. The same thing with the breath work during the day. See if you can notice your breathing. See if you can slow it down, right? See if you can breathe softer and lighter. And then allow yourself to notice that this directly affects your vagus nerve. This directly affects your autonomic nervous system and helps to bring you into a more even, equanimous state every time you do it. The more you do it, if you keep doing it more and more consistently, eventually what you're doing becomes your reality instead of something you're practicing. It's as simple as that. Kabish?